Hello, everyone. Welcome to Dataverse as well as New Stars of Data. My name is Deepthi Goguri, and today I would like to present on the topic fundamentals of security in Azure. So this presentation was supposed to be, it's a duet session along with Kai and myself. But then Kai is not feeling well. He's sick. So I will be taking it over, and I will be presenting all of the session. But then I would like to introduce my friend as well. He's a data engineer. His name is Kai Sauter, and he's been working with the data since 2008, and he's into Power BI and Azure stuff along with the SQL Server, and he's a owner, and then he's a founder of the user group data TGIF. Um, and he's also one of the organizers for Data Bash conference, which just completed a couple of weeks ago. And um, if you'd like to contact Kai Sotter on Twitter or LinkedIn, down below, those are the links. A little bit about me. Like just said, I just got awarded as Microsoft Data Platform MVP, and I did my master's in computer technology here in Chicago. And I'm also a co-organizer for a couple of user groups for the diversity, equity, inclusion user group, and also Microsoft Data and AI South Florida user group. And I also do volunteer for Women in Technology user group as well. Apart from that, I love doing arts and crafts. If you'd like to contact me on Twitter, if you have any questions later regarding this session, please contact me on LinkedIn or Twitter. So before beginning the session, I would like to talk about a little analogy which is related to security, but it is something related to bank robbery. So for example, there is this thief who want to rob the bank. So as you know, the bank have several layers of security, in-depth security layers before entering into the vault, the money vault to grab the money, right? So let's say the thief, he entered into the parking lot, and while moving into the parking lot into the door of the bank, there will be the security cameras in the parking lot. That's the outer layer of security for the bank. But then if he entered the main door, he have to break the door, right? That's a different layers of security. Once he enter into the main lock, if he could able to get into the door and then break the door, then he will be entering into the locker rooms, let's say, and each of the locker room have a different security key. It can be the physical key or it can be the digital key. So let's say like he got frustrated looking at the number of the locks that he need to break, or let's say like he broke some of them, but then got frustrated by looking into the number of keys that he have to break, and then he want to enter into the main uh, money vault, let's say where the money is resided all from the bank, right? But then let's say like there is this digital lock, and they have the authentication setup, and if he's trying to break the digital lock, there can be the alert system enabled, like if there is like um, authentication or authorization kind of uh, factor authentication setup. Like if there is like two or three times, if he couldn't break the lock, there will be an alert sending it to the 911 call, right? So he have to even break that, and if he enter into the money vault, that's when he will be getting the money. But then if you see the number of security layers that he have to break to get the money from the bank, there are many security systems that got set up, like the calls that will be the alerts that will be triggered while he's breaking the keys, the 911 calls, or the calls can go to the security person. He have to break these many layers to get into the money, right? To grab the money. The same goes with the security in Azure. The money itself is the data here, right? It is more than money, actually, the data. It is because we have like sensitive data anywhere, like in any shop or in any organization, the data is sensitive. It's more than money, right? So these layers, like when you see the different layers of security that we have in Azure, you can compare with the analogy that we talked about, the security cameras from the parking lot. We can say it's the network security, the top level security. And as you go down, we have different layers of security. They have to break all of them to enter into the data. So we are going to talk about each of these security layers today. So the security concepts, like I said, the outer layer of security, the network security, and then identity and access management, we are going to talk about today, data protection, threat protection, as well as the data governance. Let's talk about the network security, the outer layer of security in Azure. So there are different options of network security available in Azure. Let's talk from the least secure to the most secure. As you move from the left side to the right side, we will see like least secure to the most secure. Let's talk about the least secure ones. Allow access to Azure services. So once you enable this option, any resource from the Azure can connect to your database. Like you cannot connect to the on-prem servers, but then anything in Azure can connect. And like, but if you do the NS lookup, all the information is publicly available, which is not secure. You can see the public IP address and the control region information, control ring information, everything is available. And it is least secure. Um, but you might be asking, like, if it is least secure, why should we even have this option available, right? But then, like, let's say, like you are in the developer environment, you have these developer databases that you want to build, you want to work on the database for a couple of weeks, and then you wanted to delete the database, but you don't want to go with all the network security layers and the complexity of it. In those situations, you can work it out by allowing access to Azure services by just with one click. Anything can connect. You can do your test and then delete the database whenever you want to for the development purposes, right? The next level of security is firewall rules. Just the way you have firewall rules on your on-prem servers, it's the same way in Azure. Any resource you want to connect to the Azure SQL database, you need to go ahead and create a firewall rule on the top of it to connect to your database. Here, you can connect to the on-prem servers as well because you are going to create the firewall rules over there as well. But here, it is not secure as well. Um, if you do the NS lookup, you can still see the public information like the public IP address, hierarchies like the region, controlling information, everything is available. It's still not secure. The next layer of network security is virtual network rule. So here, all the like let's say you have multiple virtual networks. All these virtual networks we are going to connect using the technologies like VNet to VNet and the other type of technologies that you have. Um, you connect all of those virtual networks together by using these technologies, and you will be only creating one virtual network rule that on the virtual network that is connected to your Azure SQL database. You'll be just creating one virtual network rule. It's not like the firewall rules that you create on each of those resources connecting to the database, but just one virtual network rule on the virtual network connecting to your database. And that one you will be having the private IP address for that virtual network. So here still, if you do the NS lookup, the region information, the control ring information is still available. Let's talk about the most secure one, which is the private link. Here, the first thing, once you create the private endpoint, the internet access will be gone, and you will be getting a private link, the private IP address for your Azure SQL database. Anything in Azure, all the virtual networks, again, like it's like the similar way, like all the virtual networks will be connected using the different technologies, like I said, like the VNet to VNet, um, those kind of technologies. Like there are multiple other technologies as well if you would like to use. They are connected the same way, but then here we are creating the private endpoint for our database, and all these networks need to connect using that private IP address, and the internet access will be gone. So that is why it is the most secure ones when you compare with the other networks, like the firewall rules and the other options here. And when you do the NS lookup, the information is not shown here. Everything is secure, right? You have the private endpoint set up. So let's talk about like these options that we talked about from the network security, um, from the firewall rules and stuff. Let's see like once you create your logical server and the Azure SQL database, once you open up the Azure portal, go to your logical server. Underneath the logical server, you have the security blade, right? Underneath the security, once you go to the networking, you see the number one option that at the bottom, allow Azure services and resource to access this server. If you choose that option, you do not have to worry about the other settings. Anything in Azure can connect. But if you do not want to choose that and go to the next level, which is like creating the firewall rule, the second one, the number two. So here what I'm doing is I'm trying to connect from my local computer to the Azure SQL database. In that case, I need to add my local server IP address so that it can connect to the Azure SQL database. So I'm just adding the firewall rule over here, right? Once I do that, I'll go and connect from my local system, local server to connect to the Azure SQL database. And as my IP address is added there, I can I can securely connect to the database. But let's say I would like to remove the IP address that I just added, the firewall rule. I removed that and I did not selected allow Azure services and resources to access this servers as well. I did not choose that option, as well as like I did not even add the virtual network rule over here. Now let's directly jump into the private link, the most private, um, the no, most secure ones, which is adding the private endpoint. So one again, you'll be going to the underneath the security, you'll be going to the networking. Under the networking, select the private access where you can go ahead and create the private endpoint. I'm not going to show you the each and every step because there are a lot of stuff to cover in this session. So with couple of few clicks, you can create the private endpoint. It will be asking you the subscription name and on which network, virtual network you want to create the private endpoint. You need to provide that virtual network name. And with few clicks, you can create this private endpoint. So once I create the private endpoint, I will be connecting to the virtual machine where I created this virtual machine on the virtual network that I provided while I created the endpoint, the private endpoint. So I'm going to that particular VM and I'm trying to connect to the Azure SQL database. And all I did was like, I'm trying to find out what is the client net address where I'm connecting to, where I'm connecting from to connect to the database. And when I did that by running this particular query, I got the IP address here. But if you see, it looks like the private IP address. And how do I know that I'm connecting to the private IP address? By going into the virtual machine and looking into the underneath the networking, I see I'm connecting from the private IP address 10.0.0.7. Let's talk about the identity and access management. So when we talk about the identity and access management, it comes with the authentication and authorization. Authentication is where you have to prove that you are the person, authorized person to connect to the resource. Let's say like the multi-factor authentication. While you try to log into the azure.portal.azure.com, you will get that multi-factor authentication code, send it to your phone, and you need to type in that code to enter into the portal. That is the multi-factor authentication, and it is part of the authorization. It's like an ID card. You're showing the ID card to enter into the Azure portal. But when we talk about the authorization, it's all about the permissions to access the resources itself, like the database, table level security, that all comes under the authorization. When we talk about the authentication, for both the Azure SQL and the managed instance, it supports the SQL authentication as well as the Azure Active Directory authentication. or you can only choose the Azure Active Directory authentication only. And when you create the Azure SQL database, you will be creating the logical server, right? While you are creating the logical server for your Azure SQL database, you have to provide the ID, like the SQL authentication ID and password to create your logical server. And that ID and password, that will become your server level, the server admin. But for the managed instance, while you create the ID and the password, while creating the managed instance, that will become the sysadmin. That account will become the sysadmin automatically. And when we talk about the authorization, the access to the resources itself, we have the database roles, custom roles, default roles, um, as well as we can also create the role level security for the authorization, which is like the principle of the least privilege. For the authorization, right? When you create the logical server, this is a logical server that I created, DG test server. If you see the account ID and password, the admin ID and password that I provided, it is automatically shown as the server admin. And there are a couple of default roles that we have, which comes under the role-based access control. And this is especially for Azure. There are like couple of default roles. Like for example, the owner, contributor, and reader. It's like who can and cannot, who can access the resources, like what can and cannot be done to the resources. These are the default roles. The owner, a person who is under the owner role, can do everything. They can read, modify, and assign other people to the resources. The contributor can actually read and modify, but they cannot uh, make the other people as a owners. They can't do that. And reader, by the name itself, says like they can just read the resources. They can't change anything. And these permissions can be like in the hierarchy level. You can uh, you can give them the access at any level, all the way from the subscription till till, all the way from the subscription till the resources underneath the subscription. We want to see like what are these default roles, right? To see these default roles, go to your logical server again and go to the access control, which is IAM. By clicking on that, you will see the IAM tab open up. Click on add and click on the add role assignment, because these are the roles. That's how we will see the default roles available. And these are the owner, contributor, and the reader default roles. And you can assign other people to these roles. Let's talk now. Until now, we have seen the authorization. Now let's see the authentication. So, like we have the logins, users, just like the way we used to have in the on-prem servers, right? With the managed instance as well as the Azure SQL database, there are not much differences between them, except a little differences. Like when you create the managed instance, you can create the Azure Active Directory server admin. And once you create that, like while creating the managed instance, you can create that server admin as an Active Directory login, but you can also create the SQL or Azure AD logins as well. Just like the way you create the database users for your on-prem servers, you can create, but at the same time, you can also create the contained users. Contained users are nothing but you do not have to have a login. You can directly have the user as well as a password so that they can directly connect to the resource like the database and tables. You can directly access to the database without the login. When we see the Azure SQL database, there are a couple of differences here. Like you have the additional roles here, like for example, the login management, login manager, DB manager. These are like the roles where you can assign the other users to without making them as the server admins. That's the difference. And the other difference is like to create the contained users for the Azure SQL database, you have to have you have to log in as the Azure Active Directory server admin. That that's when you can create the other contained users and create the Active Directory users as the contained users. You can't do that with the SQL authentication login ID and password. Let's talk about the data encryption. There are like three different flavors of data protection mechanisms that are available in Azure. One is the encryption in transit. That means the while the data is moved from the application till the database and from the database to the application, while the data is in transit, the data is always protected by default. And to make that possible, we need to select the transparent layer security, which is by default we are enforced to select that. You can't skip that option. So this is always by default enabled. And you need to make sure your applications are actually supporting the TLS version that you are selecting, because there are different layers of TLS version, and sometimes they do have the deprecated versions. You need to make sure your application is still supporting the TLS version, because if it is not supporting, then you can't connect to your database. The other flavor is encryption at rest. So these are the data protection mechanism for the files at the rest, like database backup files, log files, data files. As the data is moved in and out of the drives, the data needs to be protected. And by default, it is protected. It is always encrypted by using the transparent data encryption, TDE. And the other flavor is encryption in use, which is like while the data is being processed, while your queries are being processed, the data needs to be protected even at that level. So while the data is being processed, like while your queries are being processed at the database engine level, the encryption should be also there in that phase. And that is being done by some of the technologies like the data enclaves that we are going to talk about in the coming slides. Like we discussed, like encryption in transit, you need to make sure the TLS version is supported by your application. And you need to also make sure from your application perspective, you always have the option encrypted connection from application to be turned on, because sometimes if it is turned off, you cannot connect to the database as well. And it is enforced all the time for all the connections. Like I said, this is turned on by default. Now, where do we see that, right? What are the transparent layer security options that we have? Here we have the logical server, again for the Azure SQL database. Underneath the security blades, click on the networking, and under the networking tab, go to the connectivity. And underneath the encryption in transit, you will be finding the minimum TLS version. And sometimes like TLS version 1.0, I believe it is deprecated. So you need to make sure like your application is still supporting the latest version of the TLS version if you are selecting the latest version. Again, encryption at rest. These are all about the files on the drives. As the files are accessible, as the data is moved in and out of the drives, we need to make sure like the encryption happens at this file level as well. Again, this is by default, it is encrypted. But the thing is, by default, Microsoft is going to um, take care of this encryption in the form of like managed key. So Microsoft is going to take care of these managed keys. They are going to rotate the keys and then take care of all the keys by using the product from Microsoft, which is known as Key Vault. But then there is also other option where you can go ahead and bring your own key, meaning that you will be creating your keys and you will be rotating your keys providing these access to the other users for these keys. You will be taking care of all of that stuff, but still maintain these keys within the key vault, within the Microsoft product. You can do that. We are going to see like how we can do that. So the first option here, like again, we need to go to the logical server, right? The server, here we have the SQL server actually, not the logical server, I'm sorry. Security demo is a SQL server that I built. And underneath the security layer, go to the transparent data encryption. Under the transparent data encryption, you have the first option, service managed key, that is by default taken care by Microsoft. But if you are choosing the second option, customer managed key, is where you have to build your own key and rotate your own key. Let's say we are doing the customer managed key here. Once you click on that, we need to make sure we are selecting the key. But here I did not even create the key right now. So I want to create a key, new key. To create the key, I need to have the key vault. So I will be going ahead and creating the key vault. You can go ahead and search for the key vault in the search option on the top. And then once it opens up, it is very easy to create the key vault. Once you build the key vault, you can go ahead and create the key, which is underneath the objects. If you see on the left side screen, underneath the objects, create the key, click on the key, and that's when you can create the key. Here I already created two of the sample keys, security demo 1, security demo 2. Let's say let's take an example and click on one of them to see how we can create. I clicked on security demo 1, where you can see the current version, which is like a code that is automatically popped up. You will be providing the activation date and the expiration date, because this is like bring your own key. You are responsible for providing the activation and the expiration date by yourself. Again, I clicked on this option to see the details of it. Like while you are creating the key, these are all the details you will be providing. So the first property, the key type and RSA key size, these are the internal algorithms which you will not be messing up. But then you will be providing the activation date, expiration date, and if you would like to provide the permissions to this key, you can do from here as well. So what I did was I have provided the permission to myself, right, Deepthi Goguri, to I have given a couple of permissions here to access this key. And you can see that under the access policies, underneath the key vault, like who all have access to the keys. So once I created the key, again, I'll be going to the transparent data encryption. And then now I will go ahead and change the key. I will select the key and then change the key. Click on change key. And then from there, click on the key vault name, and the key which one you want to change. Like, for example, you want to change the key to security demo 2 because we have created two keys. Click on the key and then click on select. That's when you can choose the key for your data encryption. But then if you see here, if you are bringing your own key, you are responsible to change the version of your key once it is expired. That is the last option here. If you see, click on select, and that's when you can select your key for the transparent data encryption and go ahead and click on save. And the last flavor is encryption in use. That's when the encryption happens while your queries are being processed. So like I said, we use the data enclaves technology where where there is this separate system that has been built just to encrypt and decrypt the data while the queries are being processed. So there is this one driver in between the database and the application, which is known as SQL client driver, which is responsible to make sure the data is being encrypted while moving the data from the database to the database client. by using the data enclave, meaning there is this separate system that will make sure the data is always encrypted while our queries are being processed. So the database engine delegates the operations on encrypted data to the enclave where the data can be safely decrypted and processed. So this enclave is mainly useful for the queries where you use the operators like the complex operators, like, for example, the sorting, indexing, and more. Um, so that's the technology. Let's talk a little bit about the dynamic data masking. I'm sure you have already known because it is also there on on-prem servers. We are not talking much about dynamic data masking here, but I want to just make sure like dynamic data masking can only mask the columns and data within your database, but this is not the encryption. You can still access the data. If something happens, they can still access the data on the drive level. It's not the encryption, but it is just the masking at the database level. So just like the way you create on on-prem servers, you can just go ahead and um, underneath the database, you can go ahead and click on dynamic data masking, where you can choose the schema, table, and the column that you want to mask, and it can provide you the mask function automatically. It can suggest that for you. And just like the way you give the permissions on-prem um, to mask and unmask the data, similar way you will do the same in the Azure SQL database as well once you create the masking for the columns. Let's talk about the threat protection and detection now. So here we have different options under the threat protection. The first one is, so underneath the Azure Defender, we have two options, SQL vulnerability assessment and the SQL threat detection. So the first option, SQL vulnerability assessment, is where it will assess any vulnerabilities. So basically, it will check for the configurations of your database, and if there are any known vulnerabilities, if your database is not configured properly based upon the standards of the Azure, it will show you these are the things that you need to look into. Like, look at this configuration option, it needs to be set this way. You will get those options where you can go ahead and look into and make those changes. The other option is the SQL threat detection, which comes under the Azure Defender as well, is where, like, if you are having any SQL injection attacks, or let's say your there is this other computer trying to access your database from a different location, uh, which never tried to connect to before, then you will get the alerts to your emails once you set it up, to let you know like, hey, this is the problem and someone is trying to access your database. That's SQL threat detection. It's like 24 by 7. It's like a watchman to your house, like who is entering and exiting the house and are they secure. The third one is SQL auditing, is just like the auditing that you have for the on-prem servers. We can do that in Azure SQL database as well. And the last one is Azure Security Center. It's like a single portal where you can see all the details about the Azure Defender, auditing, everything in a single pane. Let's talk about the Azure Defender. So once you open up the server, again the DG test server, which is a logical server, underneath the auditing, um, underneath the security panel, go to the auditing, and you can choose either on or off for the Microsoft Defender for SQL. We are talking about the Defender, right? Microsoft Defender. So I'm turning it off here. Once you turn it off, once you turn it on, you need to select where you want to place the collected data. I would like to create a storage account here. So you need to provide the subscription ID, and with few clicks, you can create this storage account and then provide the email address. Like, it will select, you can select and then provide the email address. and it will collect the data and it will send it to your email address. So once you enable that, after a couple of time, you immediately can't see any recommendations because it needs to collect the data, right? Once you enable it, wait for a couple of minutes till hours to see the data, to see that assessment details. So underneath the security, go to the Microsoft Defender for Cloud. And I have waited for a couple of hours to see how it looks like. I have got a couple of recommendations, alerts, security alerts, and findings. So under the recommendations, you can see the details. And to look into more detail, you will be selecting on the view additional recommendations down below. Once you click on that, you can see more details into like which one you need to more focus on. Green ones are okay, and like you can look into them, but then the red ones are really the ones that you have to look into. So let's say, for example, I have I have sorry, let me see here what I try to do. Uh, so so this is at the server level, but you can also look at the database level. Underneath the database, Adventure Works here, that is my database. You can also find the Microsoft Defender for Cloud tab at the server level as well as the database level. So I'm clicking on the database to see what are my findings here. And if you see, I can also see the vulnerability assessment findings here. You can see the IDs, and these are the standards from the Azure. So if you would like to follow, you can go ahead and enable it. If you want to ignore, it's totally up to you based upon your environment. So for example, I am choosing the first one, which is like the security check. Database owners are as expected. Once I click on that, I would like to see like what is it actually recommending. So it is recommending me the remediation basically to remove any unnecessary database owners for giving the excessive permissions. It's not like you have to go ahead and change that. It is just like the baseline that it is showing. You can either accept it or you can just ignore it. You can either add all the results as a baseline or you can remove it from the baseline. And let's talk about the auditing now. Underneath the server, right? Again, security pane, go to the auditing. So underneath the auditing, Azure SQL auditing, this is at the logical server level. So once you enable, it is by default not enabled. You need to enable it. But once you enable it at the logical server level, it is automatically being enabled at the database level as well. So once you enable that, you need to provide the subscription details and where you want to actually store this data. I would like to store this data in my workspace, which is log analytics. By default, it has actually created a default workspace. You can also store it in storage account as well. And then the last option is like enable auditing of Microsoft support operations. So this is all like this option is especially for the support from Microsoft. Like if you have some issue and if you have to create a ticket with Microsoft support, they can actually access these logs, these auditing logs, only when you enable this option. And once I open up the database level now, again, underneath the security, I have the auditing option. Underneath the auditing blade, click on view audit logs. To see the logs, once you open up the audit logs, go ahead and click on the dashboard to see it in a centralized view. Here, you will see two options here. One is related to the auditing. The left side, which I did not highlight it, is regarding the data governance, which we are going to talk about in the coming slides. But here we want to see what kind of data is audited, right? So click on this Azure SQL Security Insights. Here we see the audit distribution. If you see, it shows like batch completed, database authentication, RPC completed. These are the audit logs, right? Click on that. And then you will be finding all of these audit logs together in this pane. For example, I clicked on one of the results where I have seen like all the details like what is the server principal name, what is the query, which database and which user connected and who run what, right? You can see even the query. It's just like the audit logs you see on-prem. All the details are here. Now let's talk about the data governance, which is like comes under the data classification. So once you open up the database, again, Azure SQL database here, underneath the security, you'll go to the data discovery and classification. Once you open up that, so basically, what is this data classification? You can also classify the data based upon how sensitive your data is. Let's say you have a column name SSN, right? The last name, um, or like passport number. This is like the sensitive column data where you can make sure like this data is actually tagged as sensitive so that the next time anyone try to access the data without your knowledge, you'll get an alert. You will get an alert and details are shown in the Azure portal where you can go ahead and see what query has executed, what columns are accessed, who accessed it, and all from where that connection is coming from, all of those details. So to classify the data, it is very simple. You'll be selecting the schema name, table name, column name, and then you will be selecting the sensitivity label, like for example, highly confidential or confidential data. So once you do that, to access who have actually accessed those sensitive columns, you can see the data through the audit logs. Remember, we have talked about like you can access the audit logs from the server, from the logical server level or at the database level. So here we are going to the database level, go to the auditing underneath the security, select the audit logs, and in the overview, you can see the data classification information. Left side, you can see the number of queries that are accessing the sensitivity label. But right side, the green color circle shows what actual queries have executed, accessing those sensitivity columns. Click on that to view the actual queries. So I have opened that and I have found that in my demo, I have actually tried to access the sensitivity columns once I created those classifications. Here, if you see the query, the sales order ID is a column that I have created as a sensitivity label. So I have accessed that and all the details are shown here if you see. That's how you can access who accessed what and who accessed the sensitivity columns. I think I covered all of the layers and I do not know if I crossed the time, but these are the resources. Like if you would like to go in detail regarding the security, there is this security couple of sessions, like 4 to 5 sessions from Microsoft. Every single session is like about an hour, like it's an in-depth security. I have followed all of these resources to prepare my presentation, and I would like to thank each one of you for attending the session, and I would like to thank the organizers of Dativerse for giving me this wonderful opportunity, and a big shout out to Jess for moderating my session. Thank you so much.